I'm Molly Hartman, 70 years old, and on the night I thought I'd be blowing out birthday candles, two police officers stepped into my foyer with a warrant in hand. My daughter-in-law, Brooke, stood nearby with her arms folded, her smile polite but distant. My son, Zach, came down the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed anywhere but mine. A few minutes later, an officer reached under the throw pillow on my neatly made bed and pulled out a small plastic bag of drugs I had never seen. Brooke let out a gasp so perfect it could have been rehearsed, and Zach didn't say a word. By the time they led me out in handcuffs, I knew the night had taken a turn I would never forget. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe if you've ever learned the hard way that trust can be the most dangerous gift you give. I was born and raised in a small Ohio town where my parents taught me that a person's word was worth more than any contract. My father was a postal worker who never missed a day on his route, and my mother kept the house running with a quiet efficiency that made everything feel steady. We didn't have much, but we shared what we could: a hot casserole for a sick neighbor, a few dollars slipped into the church collection plate even when bills were tight. Those early lessons in kindness and integrity shaped the way I built my life. I became a teacher, married a man who valued honesty as much as I did, and raised my son to believe those same principles mattered. Life shifted after my husband passed, but I managed. I paid off the house, kept up with my retirement fund, and stayed active in my community. When Zach married Brooke, I welcomed her warmly. She came from a more polished world: designer handbags, manicured nails, dinner reservations instead of potlucks. I thought our differences might balance each other. At first, they seemed happy to visit to share meals in my kitchen to talk about plans for the future. But slowly, subtle changes crept in. Brooke began making small decisions in my home without asking. Zach grew quieter, less open. I told myself it was just the shift of married life. That birthday evening, I was folding napkins for my own dinner table when the doorbell rang. Brooke answered like it was her own home, and within moments, the officers were standing in my living room. The search was quick, almost too quick, and when they found the drugs, no one looked surprised but me. At the station, the light above the table was cold and unblinking. The voices that questioned me were polite, almost detached, as if I were just another file in their caseload. They held me for 2 nights without bail. No phone call came from Zach, no message from Brooke. I sat on the narrow cot, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air, and tried to understand how the people I had loved most could let this happen. When I finally walked out of the station, the sun was too bright, the air too sharp against my skin. I took the bus home, my house keys and wallet in a plastic bag, feeling like a stranger on my own street. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. Brooke was gone, but Zach was in the backyard trimming hedges with his back to me. He didn't turn around. I went to my room and stood in the doorway, staring at the pillow that had been replaced neatly, the rug vacuumed, as if nothing had happened. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over, and that whatever game they had started, I was now part of it. Zach knocked on my bedroom door just once before stepping inside. He didn't ask if it was a good time. In his hands was a slim folder, the kind that looked harmless until you opened it. He set it on the foot of my bed and told me he'd organized a few things to make life easier if trouble like this ever came up again. His voice was even, almost pleasant, but there was no softness in it. I slid the papers out and began to leaf through them while keeping my eyes on him. Most of the forms were financial documents, account authorizations, care agreements, medical directives. Each one written in language that looked official but vague. There were places for my signature at the bottom of nearly every page. Zach explained that Brooke had helped draft them for my protection, so no one could take advantage of me if I ever became unstable again. The word hung in the air like a splinter. I didn't answer. I simply placed the papers back in the folder and told him I needed rest. He smiled faintly, like he believed I'd eventually sign. That night, I sat in the dark and made a list in my small leather notebook. Not a list of revenge, but of clarity. Everything still in my name. Every account, every property, deed, every contract I'd ever signed. In the corner of my garage was an old metal cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. The next morning, I unlocked it and found exactly what I remembered: my late husband's files, the original will, and a thick envelope marked backup. Inside was an unactivated power of attorney document signed years earlier with one important detail. The name on it wasn't Zach's. It was my nephew, Dylan Reeves. I stood there holding the paper, remembering the boy who used to sit on my kitchen counter, swinging his legs while I made pancakes. Dylan was grown now, working for a logistics firm in another state. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, but he was steady, dependable, and I had chosen him for a reason back then. I placed the document carefully into my handbag, locked the cabinet again, and felt a small shift inside me. Later that morning, I walked the long way to the bank, letting the sound of my footsteps clear my thoughts. Mrs. Langston, my longtime account manager, greeted me with her usual half-smile. I told her I wanted to review my beneficiary list. In her office, I slid a sheet of names across the desk: old friends, a few relatives, even 2 of my former students who had kept in touch over the years. Zach and Brooke were no longer on it. I also asked her to flag my accounts for any suspicious activity and to set up internal alerts. She didn't ask why, but I could see in her eyes that she understood. 2 blocks away, I found myself at the door of a small law firm, wedged between a dry cleaner and a tailor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon polish. Mr. Mroy, the attorney who had once helped me with an education program dispute, remembered me right away. I laid the unactivated power of attorney on his desk and asked him to update it quietly, without triggering any notifications. We tightened the clauses, added specific restrictions, and secured a fresh copy in his office safe, with another in my bag. When I arrived home, Brooke was in the kitchen, her voice bright as she pulled a peach cobbler from the oven. She offered me a slice, speaking as though the last few days had been nothing but a passing inconvenience. I accepted, ate politely, and excused myself. Upstairs, I opened a desk drawer and took out a small black GoPro camera I'd used during the pandemic to record lessons for senior students. I charged it overnight and placed it on a high shelf behind my books, angled toward the center of the room. The next few days passed quietly. On Thursday, I watched through the front window as Brooke slipped into my bedroom while I was outside in the garden. She moved the pillow, checked under the mattress, and rifled through the closet. She wasn't searching. She was rehearsing. The following day, Zach brought me another folder, this one containing a living trust proposal and emergency guardianship papers. His tone was gentle, almost concerned, as he suggested I review them at my own pace. I told him I would. That evening, I uploaded the hidden camera footage to a secure drive labeled with dates and times. Over the weekend, I went through every document Zach had slipped into that first folder. The legal language was careful, but it granted him sweeping control over my finances and medical care. One form allowed him to move me into a facility without a second medical opinion. Another designated him as my financial guardian in the event of cognitive decline, a term left undefined. I knew they expected me to sign without question. On Monday morning, I drove to a small notary office across town. There, I signed 2 forms, one revoking all previous powers of attorney, and one naming Dylan as my sole financial and medical decision-maker if I became incapacitated. Copies went to Mr. Mroy's office. The originals went into a fireproof box under my bed. By Wednesday, Brooke was at it again this time, leaving a glossy brochure for a retirement community on my nightstand. I slid it into the trash without a word. That afternoon, I called Hazel Bennett, a former student who now worked as a freelance analyst for an asset tracing firm. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but she answered on the second ring. I explained that I needed a discreet favor, just a quiet review of a few accounts I suspected had been tampered with. She agreed without hesitation. By Friday, I had everything I needed for the next step: the updated legal documents, the altered beneficiary list, the camera footage, and Hazel's confirmation that my accounts were under watch. That evening, Brooke sat beside me on the couch with a casserole on her lap, speaking in that careful tone she used when she wanted to sound nurturing. She told me she and Zach only wanted to make sure I was cared for and not overwhelmed by all the responsibilities I had at my age. I nodded, let her think she was making progress, and kept my plans to myself. The next morning, Hazel sent me an encrypted email. There had been unsuccessful login attempts on 2 of my accounts, both from devices linked to Zach's home network. I forwarded the information to Mr. Morroy, who advised me to let him handle all further contact. I agreed. That night, standing at the kitchen sink with the house empty around me, I realized I was no longer frightened. Whatever game they thought they were playing, I was finally ready to play my part. Hazel's report arrived late Friday evening, just as the light was fading from the kitchen window. She had traced multiple failed login attempts on 2 of my accounts, all tied to devices registered under Zach's home network. The times varied, some in the middle of the night, others in the early morning hours. I saved the file to an encrypted folder and called Mr. Morroy. His voice was steady as he told me not to respond to anything they sent me directly. From now on, he would handle every piece of communication. I agreed, relieved to place that burden somewhere safe. Saturday morning came with an odd stillness. Brooke was already in the garden pruning roses she hadn't planted, wearing a crisp linen apron. Zach sat in the dining room with his laptop open, his gaze fixed on the screen. I moved quietly through the house, careful not to break the fragile surface of their routine. In my sunroom, I opened a worn box of files, not digital copies, but the originals with weight and signatures, the kind of papers you could hold in your hands. As I sifted through them, I found a property deed I hadn't thought about in years. It was for a small parcel of land near Oakhurst, bought decades ago, with my late husband, as a potential summer project. The cabin on it had been simple but sturdy, and the land was fully paid for. I realized it was still mine, untouched, and free of any claims. The thought settled in me like a small, steady flame. The next morning, I drove out to see it. The cabin was weathered, but standing, its roof sagging slightly on one side, the windows streaked with dirt. The surrounding land had grown wild grass, tall and bending in the wind, but the air felt cleaner than any I had breathed in months. I stood on the porch and listened to the quiet. No voices, no footsteps, just wind moving through the trees. I knew I needed a place like this somewhere away from the constant tension of my own home. Back in the city, I called Hazel and arranged for a discreet sale of a small mutual fund I kept under a different name. She handled it quickly and without questions. Within days, the funds had cleared, and I contacted a local contractor in Oakhurst to start repairs on the cabin. New windows, a roof replacement, and updated wiring were all scheduled within the month. I told no one in my family. At home, I kept the peace. I prepared dinner, folded laundry, and offered small compliments that made Brooke pause in subtle confusion. She seemed to think she was wearing me down, but my work was happening elsewhere. Late Friday afternoon, Mr. Morroy called again. The login attempts had continued now from multiple IP addresses, each one more frequent than the last. He had already flagged the activity with the bank's fraud department. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. We confirmed the next step in our plan. That evening, as I passed Zach in the hallway, he muttered something about a meeting and kept walking. Brooke was in the living room with her tablet, glancing up only long enough to give me a tight smile. I returned it easily. They understood smiles. They didn't notice what lived behind them. Saturday, I told them I had a doctor's appointment across town. Neither of them asked questions. I drove straight to the cabin. The new cedar shingles gleamed in the morning light, and the fresh porch steps creaked slightly under my weight. Inside, the scent of sawdust and new wiring filled the air. The electrician offered me a cup of coffee, and we sat on the edge of the porch for a quiet moment before I walked the property alone. On my way back, I stopped by Mr. Morroy's office to sign 2 documents. The first granted him full legal authority to act on my behalf in any dispute with Zach or Brooke. The second was a supplemental will removing their names from any inheritance and redirecting my estate to causes I trusted. When I left his office, my bag felt lighter, even though the papers were still inside. That night at dinner, Brooke talked about a new neighbor she found charming. Zach barely touched his food. I nodded where appropriate, letting the conversation pass over me like water. Later in my room, I checked the hidden camera footage. It showed Zach rifling through my desk drawers with his phone in hand, and Brooke opening the study cabinet and taking photos of old documents. I uploaded everything to Hazel's cloud and backed it up to an external drive I kept in my purse. Sunday morning, another message came from Hazel. 2 older accounts at Keystone Bank had been frozen after unauthorized login attempts from Brooke's marketing agency. This was the 3rd incident in 10 days. Hazel had already sent the full report to Mr. Morroy. Nothing had been stolen, but the pattern was clear. That afternoon, I packed a small suitcase with the essentials: my husband's watch, a photograph of Dylan as a boy, and my leather-bound journal with important dates and contacts. That evening, Zach approached me with a new power of attorney form, claiming the previous one contained errors. He handed it over with the same practiced concern I had come to recognize. I smiled, told him I'd think about it, and filed it away with the rest of the evidence. By dawn the next morning, I was dressed, my suitcase in the car, and a cooler packed with fruit and sandwiches. I left a short note on the kitchen counter, where they wouldn't see it until later. I need some air. By the time they found it, I was 2 hours away, heading toward the cabin. When I arrived, the locks had been changed, the new landline was working, and a stack of firewood sat neatly by the porch. Copies of my updated legal protections were already secured in the safe. I unpacked slowly, each item placed with care, claiming the space as mine. Later, I drove into the nearby town to open a new P.O. box and a trust account under my maiden name. Hazel had created a clean identity trail separate from anything Zach or Brooke could access. That evening, I lit a fire and sat in the old rocking chair by the window. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full of things I had nearly forgotten I needed. The next morning, I called Hazel and told her to move forward with the final stage, transferring all remaining assets into the protected trust, completely excluding Zach and Brooke. She didn't ask for details. She only said it was already underway. A few days later, Hazel intercepted a letter Zach had mailed to my old address. Inside was another copy of the power of attorney, this time in Brooke's handwriting, along with a note saying they were worried about me. We initiated the formal notification clause in my estate file, which meant all communication had to go through Mr. Morroy from now on. That night, I slept without locking the cabin door. No one knew where I was, and for the first time in months, that felt like safety. The first week at the cabin passed without a single call message or unexpected knock. Each morning, I made coffee on the old gas stove, wrapped a shawl over my shoulders, and watched the fog lift off the trees. The stillness was a relief, but I kept my days busy. I organized the small pantry, stacked the firewood more neatly, and marked off every completed repair on the list the contractor had left me. The place felt like mine in a way the house in the city hadn't for months. Midweek, Hazel called to update me on the final asset transfers. The trust account was now fully funded, every clause airtight, and all linked accounts scrubbed of any connection to Zach or Brooke. She spoke in her usual calm tone, but I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. When we hung up, I took a slow walk down the gravel drive to the main road, just to feel the sun on my face. That evening, I found an envelope tucked under the cabin's screen door. My name was written in a familiar hand. Inside was a letter from Dylan. He had heard I'd left the city and wanted to know if I was all right. He wrote that he didn't believe the stories being told, that he missed me, and that he hoped we could see each other. I read it twice before setting it on the small table by the window. The next morning, I wrote him back. I kept it short and clear. I was safe. I wasn't gone, and if he wanted to visit, he would need to come quietly. I sealed the envelope and dropped it at the general store in town, knowing the clerk would give it to him the next time he passed through. Then I stopped by the post office to check my new P.O. box. It held nothing but a flyer for a hardware sale. Yet even that small act of sorting my own mail felt like a reclamation. By Friday, Hazel forwarded a copy of a new letter Zach had sent to my old address. In it, he claimed I was missing and possibly unwell. Brooke had added a statement saying I was paranoid and delusional. Hazel already had my recent medical evaluation on file and sent it directly to Mr. Morroy. Their attempt to build a case had failed before it began. I spent the rest of the day splitting kindling for the wood stove, the air crisp and sharp with the scent of cedar. On Saturday, I drove into the county seat with Hazel to file a formal protective order. It covered both physical safety and financial control, ensuring no one could petition for authority over me without my personal appearance before a judge. The clerk's office was quiet, and the paperwork was straightforward. Walking out, I felt the weight of a door closing behind me. That night, I sat at the cabin table and sorted through an old box I'd brought from the city. Inside were photographs of family picnics, postcards from former students, and a bundle of letters from my sister before she passed. I kept the ones that mattered and burned the rest in the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, sending a faint scent of old paper into the room. 2 days later, just after breakfast, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Dylan stood there with a paper bag of groceries in his arms. He looked older than I remembered, his hair shorter, his shoulders squared. I stepped aside, and he walked in without hesitation. At the table, he unpacked bread, apples, cheese, and a small tin of coffee. We made tea and sat listening to the wood stove creak in the corner. After a long silence, he told me he had left Zach and Brooke's house. He'd seen enough to know the truth, though he didn't have every detail. Brooke still believed she could fix things, but it was clear to him her focus wasn't family, it was money. He said he didn't know how to make things right, but he no longer wanted to be part of their plans. We talked for hours, some of it about the situation. Most of it about other things, the way the garden used to flood in spring, how Zach had cried over his first lost dog, how quiet the house had become after Brooke moved in. When Dylan left, he didn't ask for forgiveness or for a place in my plans. He just said he wanted to visit again if I was willing. I told him I was. That night, I added his name to the trust. Not as an act of repayment, but because it felt right. Outside, the wind shifted through the pines, and the cabin settled into its nighttime stillness. I knew there was more ahead, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like I had an ally who saw me as I was, not as someone to be managed. Dylan's visit stayed with me long after his truck disappeared down the gravel road. The cabin felt warmer somehow, though the air outside had turned sharp with the early signs of fall. I kept my days steady, stacking firewood, making small repairs, and cooking simple meals. Each task gave me time to think about what came next. The trust was solid, the accounts locked, but there was still one more step before I could say this was truly finished. That Thursday, Hazel called with a quiet urgency in her voice. She had traced another attempt to access one of my old accounts, this time through a device registered at Brooke's marketing agency. It was the 4th incident in 2 weeks. The bank's fraud department had flagged it, but Hazel wanted my permission to let Mr. Morroy move forward with the next part of our plan. I told her to proceed. The next morning, I drove into town and met Hazel at a small cafe off Main Street. She slid a folder across the table, its contents neatly organized and tabbed. Inside were printouts of the access attempts, the IP addresses, and timestamps. She had even included screenshots from the camera footage I'd been uploading, showing Brooke and Zach handling documents that didn't belong to them. This, she said, tapping the folder, is enough to make them stop. I nodded, knowing she was right. From the cafe, I walked to Mr. Morroy's office. He greeted me with a brief smile, then closed the door behind us. We reviewed the evidence together, piece by piece. When we were done, he pulled out 2 new documents. The first was a formal declaration confirming that all of my assets, the house, the cabin, and every financial account, were now held in an irrevocable charitable trust. The second listed the new beneficiaries, none of them family. Once they see this, he said they'll understand there's nothing left to take. Back at the cabin that evening, I built a small fire and poured tea. I knew this would be the last stretch before the confrontation, and I wanted to be ready. Over the weekend, I kept the phone close, waiting for Roy's call. It came Monday morning. He told me he had arranged a meeting with Zach and Brooke at a quiet Italian restaurant in the city. We would meet there Friday at 5 o'clock sharp. The week passed in a calm that felt almost unnatural. I prepared the cabin for my absence, covering the woodpile, locking away important papers, and leaving fresh water for the contractor's crew. On Friday afternoon, I dressed in a charcoal coat and simple pearl earrings, the kind of outfit that made me feel steady. I drove into the city, parking a few blocks from the restaurant. The walk helped settle my breathing. When I stepped into the private dining room, Roy was already seated, a stack of folders at his side. A few minutes later, Zach and Brooke arrived together. Brooke wore a bright smile that didn't touch her eyes. Zach's expression was harder to read, his jaw set. We exchanged polite greetings, then Roy began. He opened the first folder and read the declaration aloud, making it clear that my assets were no longer accessible to any family member not explicitly named. Brooke blinked, glancing at Zach, who shifted in his seat. There must be some misunderstanding, she began, but I shook my head. No misunderstanding, I said quietly. The second folder held copies of the surveillance footage and the bank reports. Roy placed them on the table without a word. Brooke leaned forward, her hands clasped, while Zach stared at the still images of himself and Brooke in my study. Neither of them spoke. There will be no charges pressed, Roy said evenly. This is about prevention, not punishment. Finally, he opened the third folder, the one listing the new beneficiaries. Brooke's voice caught as she realized the names weren't family. Zach's gaze stayed fixed on the page, his face pale. I told them the trust would support women over 60 who had lost their homes, their pensions, and their security, women who reminded me of myself. The words landed without resistance. There was nothing for them to argue. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the cold evening air, my steps steady. Back at the cabin, I lit the fireplace and sat in the rocking chair by the window. The confrontation had been quiet, almost simple, but it had drawn a line neither of them could cross again. I went to bed early that night, the fire still crackling in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying with it the feeling that something had shifted for good. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I was ready for it. When I woke the morning after the meeting, the cabin was still. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass outside, and the cold in the air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in weeks. I made coffee and sat by the window, replaying every detail from the restaurant. There had been no shouting, no pleading, only the finality of facts laid on a table they could no longer clear. The trust documents were sealed, and Roy had gone over them with me one more time by phone that evening. Every account was secure, every asset protected. Zach and Brooke had no path back into my affairs. What remained now was deciding how I wanted to use what I had. The thought of it was less about numbers and more about direction. A few days later, Hazel drove out to see me. She brought a banker's box filled with mail she'd been collecting from the P.O. box and my old address. We set it on the kitchen table and sorted through it together. Most of it was routine bank statements, insurance notices, the kind of envelopes that never contained surprises. But at the bottom was a letter from the state board confirming approval for a program I had applied to months ago. The idea had begun quietly during one of my first meetings with Roy and a legal aid contact named Connie. We had talked about creating a small grant system for women over 60 who had lost their homes or pensions, women who needed a way to begin again. Now the approval meant it was real. We had even chosen a named second foundation. Holding the letter, I thought of the faces I had in mind when we drafted the proposal. Women from church who had been widowed and forced to leave the homes they'd built, a retired nurse who had taken on part-time work after her retirement savings disappeared, a neighbor who'd once borrowed my typewriter to fill out job applications. This program would mean they could choose their own next steps without owing anyone for the privilege. The first funding decisions were simple. 3 women would receive grants that fall, one training in home health care, another studying bookkeeping, and a third taking basic computer classes so she could apply for jobs online without asking her grandson for help. The board's letter confirmed each award. I set the page aside carefully, thinking about how to let them know. The next afternoon, Dylan called. His voice was steady, but I could hear a question beneath his words. He asked if I'd like to meet for a walk along the river in the city park. I paused for a moment, then agreed. When we met, the air was cool, the leaves beginning to turn, and the slow pace of his steps matched mine. We didn't talk much at first. Dylan pointed out small things along the path, the way the light caught in the water, a squirrel darting between tree roots, a mother balancing her child on one hip while tying her shoe. He seemed to be paying attention in a way I hadn't seen before. Halfway through the walk, he stopped and looked at me. "I see it now," he said. There was no explanation, and none was needed. When we parted, he handed me a scarf I'd left in his truck years ago. I took it, feeling the soft wool between my hands, and thanked him. Back at the cabin that evening, I placed it on the back of the rocking chair and sat for a long while watching the fire burn down. The week that followed was quiet. I cooked. I wrote in my journal, and I began outlining the stories I wanted to include in a memoir, not for publication, but to keep the truth in one place. Each morning, I worked for an hour before breakfast, the pen moving steadily across the page. The rest of the day was for tending to the cabin and for small things that made the space mine: a new rug in the kitchen, a shelf for the pantry curtains I sewed from old fabric. Zach and Brooke didn't call. Hazel heard nothing more from their networks. Roy believed they had understood finally that their part in my life was over. If they tried again, the legal protections in place would stop them before they could begin. The quiet wasn't just the absence of trouble, it was the presence of something I had been missing for a long time. One evening, as I closed the curtains against the early dark, I thought about the women who would soon receive their first second foundation checks. I pictured the nurse unpacking her textbooks, the widow measuring fabric at her new job, the grandmother turning on a computer in a classroom. The image settled over me like a blanket. This, I realized, was the life I wanted to live now, not in defense, but in purpose. A light rain moved through the hills the morning Dylan came back to the cabin. The gravel drive was slick under his truck tires, and I stepped out onto the porch before he could knock. He held a paper sack in one arm, a thermos in the other. "Thought you might want company," he said, glancing at the woodpile stacked high against the cabin wall. Inside, we set the bag on the table, fresh bread, a wedge of cheese, a jar of apple butter, and poured tea from the thermos. The fire was still warm from the morning, casting a slow, steady heat through the room. Dylan asked how the program was going, and I told him about the first 3 women who would be receiving their grants. He listened without interrupting, nodding once in a while. After lunch, we took a walk around the property. The ground was soft from the rain, the air carrying the smell of wet pine. Dylan paused near the edge of the clearing, looking out at the tree line. "I didn't realize how much I missed quiet like this," he said. His voice was low, almost more to himself than to me. We walked back without speaking much more, the sound of our steps on damp earth filling the space between us. The next day, a call came from Hazel. She had just been contacted by the bank's legal department. Zach and Brooke had made one last attempt to dispute the trust arrangements. The claim hadn't gone far. The documents were airtight, and the fraud report stood against them. Still, the bank wanted my confirmation in writing that Maroy remained my sole representative. I told Hazel I'd handle it that afternoon. Driving into town, I thought about the restaurant meeting, how certain Zach had looked when he walked in, and how small his expression had become by the time we left. Whatever he and Brooke had expected to happen afterward, it clearly wasn't this. At the bank, I signed the required forms, each page initialed, each signature steady. The branch manager shook my hand before I left, telling me they'd be in touch only if absolutely necessary. Back at the cabin, Dylan was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee. He'd taken it upon himself to repair the loose hinge on the screen door. "Figured I owed you at least," that he said with a faint smile. We talked for a while about the repairs still on the contractor's list, about the possibility of adding a small shed before winter. It was the kind of conversation that felt ordinary in the best way. 2 evenings later, the first letter from one of the grant recipients arrived. It was handwritten, the loops and slants of the pen showing careful thought. She thanked me for the chance to return to school for bookkeeping, explaining how she'd already enrolled in classes starting next month. I read it twice before placing it in the desk drawer where I kept the approval notices. Dylan stopped by more often after that. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes just an extra thermos of tea. Once he arrived with an old photograph of us planting tomatoes in my city backyard years ago. "Found it in a box at my place," he said, sliding it across the table. I studied the image, him barefoot in the dirt, me in a wide-brimmed hat, and placed it under the magnet on the refrigerator door. Near the end of the week, Maroy called. His tone was lighter than I'd heard in months. "It's over," he said. Zach and Brooke had formally withdrawn their dispute and closed the accounts they'd been using for the unauthorized access attempts. He doubted they would reach out again. When we ended the call, I stood for a moment in the kitchen, the quiet around me deepening in a way I hadn't expected. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside. The rain had cleared, leaving the grass jeweled with dew. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker tapped out a slow rhythm. For the first time, in what felt like a long season, the stillness carried no weight, only space. I went back inside, lit the stove, and set the kettle on. Dylan was due to stop by later, and I found myself looking forward to it, not out of need, but because it was a choice. The difference was subtle, but I could feel it. Spring eased its way into the hills, not with sudden warmth, but with small, steady changes. The grass thickened buds opened along the branches, and the mornings carried a softer light through the cabin windows. I found myself rising earlier, not out of habit, but because I wanted to see the day begin. The second foundation grants had all been sent. Hazel kept me updated as the women started their programs, the nurse beginning her home healthcare training, the widow mastering the bookkeeping software, and the grandmother sending her first email from a classroom computer. Each update felt like another brick laid in something that would outlast me. Zach and Brooke never contacted me again. If they had tried, Maroy would have been the one to hear it. Their absence wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply the closing of a door I no longer needed to open. Even the memories of their schemes felt lighter now, as if they belonged to another season entirely. Dylan continued to visit when he could. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times, we shared a meal in near silence. There was no rush to define what his place would be in my life now. It was enough that trust once broken was finding its way back in small, careful steps. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with my journal open, looking over the pages I'd filled since I left the city. The words were less about loss now, and more about living the repairs to the cabin, the scent of pine after rain, the quiet of evenings by the fire. It struck me how far I had come from the day 2 officers stepped into my home with a false charge and a hidden plan behind it. What I had regained wasn't just property or accounts. It was the simple right to decide what my life looked like and who was allowed to be part of it. That right, I realized, was worth more than anything I could sign over on paper. As the sun began to set, I carried a blanket to the porch and settled into the rocking chair. The air was cool and the horizon was brushed with the first stars. I thought about how many times I'd been told to be patient to wait for people to come around, but peace hadn't come from waiting. It had come from acting, from drawing a line, and choosing to protect what I had built. If you've ever had to step away from someone you loved in order to protect yourself, you know it isn't easy. But sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself and for what matters is saying enough. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If any part of my story has stayed with you, I'd be glad to hear it. Maybe it reminded you of your own turning point, or maybe it gave you a glimpse of one ahead. Either way, we're not alone in finding our way back to ourselves.